first panel of this Wonderfest weekend for the 9th annual Wonderfest Bay Area Festival of Science. The first panel today is on the question, do drug companies help or hurt patients? I will be moderating. I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. My name is Henri de Marcellus, and I teach at the Branson School, which, along with Stanford and Berkeley, host the Wonderfest. Our two speakers today are speaking second. First, let me tell you about the format. There'll be half an hour in which each of the two speakers will speak for roughly 15 minutes. And then there will be a dialogue between the two speakers for half an hour that hopefully will elicit some further issues and questions that you might have. And then for the last half hour, we will take questions from you, and I will help moderate that. I'm your moderator. The second of the two speakers is Dr. Gil Chu, Professor of Medicine and Biochemistry at the Stanford School of Medicine. He conducts research in his laboratory on DNA repair, and he also cares for cancer patients. So both research and hands-on experience with this issue. He's been at Stanford for 25 years. Speaking first is Tom Wandless, Assistant Professor of Chemical and Systems Biology. He has been at Stanford for 13 years, and he, too, conducts research inventing new techniques for biology research. Primarily, he's a synthetic chemist, and hence his interest in medicine, and particularly the interface between chemistry and biology. Before we begin, could I just quickly ask you to turn off any cell phones or pagers that you might have? And then would you join me in welcoming Tom Wandless to begin this panel? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Henri, and welcome to everyone to the first Wonderfest panel discussion this afternoon. So when I was first approached about being part of this occasion this afternoon, the original title was slightly different. It was, as you see on the screen, Will New Drugs Help or Hurt Patients? And I thought, I'd be happy to talk about this because this should last all of 36 seconds. I mean, this is such a self-evident, the answers here are so self-evident that it wouldn't really, take much time at all. And I would lay waste to whoever came up and tried to argue the opposite position. But of course, that also got me thinking about, this whole idea of new drugs and how they're made. And as I began thinking about it, I was thinking about the constant interplay between science and technology and the differences between these two spheres. Thinking about science as people trying to understand the fundamental rules of how things work in our world. And then maybe a bit things on more on the applied side, that is technology. How do you take the fundamental principles and turn them into devices or drugs or other things that change, hopefully improve the human condition? And as I was thinking about this, I thought that at the interface of science and technology, perhaps the biggest sort of commercial player taking advantage of both of these lines of inquiry is really group of individuals trying to invent medicines to change the human condition, to improve the human condition. Because it's very hard to develop new drugs if you don't understand the fundamental nature of disease and what causes the disease. So there's a lot of basic science in pharmaceutical development, but there's also really quite a lot of technology as well, related to the drugs themselves, as well as all the tools that the basic scientists use to invent new medicines. So when I was thinking about, one of the things that I did was think about the question of life expectancy. And what you're looking at here is a map which shows in color code the life expectancy of a person born in the year 2006. And the scale is on the left-hand side here, the more red the country is colored, the worse your life expectancy or the shorter your life expectancy is. So the dark red is minus 50. You see a lot of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and dark red colors. Through the very dark green, Canada is 80 plus. And so then just for a point of comparison, in the United States, in the year 1900, a person born in the year 1900 had an average life expectancy of 47 years. Born in 2006, 78.2, the average of the two genders. So it's crystal clear at some level that, over the past century, the quality of life of humans in the world has improved immensely. For some people, it's improved more than others, and that has a lot to do with a number of different factors. I'm not going to try to argue that new medicines are the primary result of this. The fact that these numbers have changed this much, and the fact that the colors have become so green and yellow where they were once red, really has mostly to do with our understanding of nutrition, access to clean water, and good sanitation. Those three things have had a greater impact on life expectancy than new medicines. But new medicines have clearly been important, because if we think back 100 years, even a simple bacterial infection, we had no drugs to treat. And more sophisticated diseases such as high blood pressure or high cholesterol leading to heart disease, we now have a wide variety of different therapeutics to use to try to treat these diseases. So it's really, as far as I'm concerned, a no-brainer. As the change in color at the title tells you, there's no doubt that new drugs help patients. I can't imagine anyone who would want to go back 106 years and not have these tools available. It's a much more interesting question, which is the one that we sort of morph the title into, which is, do drug companies help or hurt patients? And since drug companies are responsible for the vast majority of new drugs, the two questions are related. As I said before, this interface of science and technology that gives rise to new medicines is very important, but it's also very important to remember that it's a business with all the good and the bad that goes with that. So just very briefly, I wanted to try to outline to zeroth order, what is it that drug companies do? So in a perfect world, they take a look at a particular disease and they try to figure out how to improve that disease for human beings. And to do that, they often try to find something in the body or in a cell that is incorrect or can be perturbed to have an effect on that disease. That's typically called validating targets or credentialing targets. Because of all the thousands, tens of thousands of genes that give rise to proteins and other things in your body, trying to figure out which of those are important for causing high blood pressure or hypertension or other kind hyperlipidemia, other kinds of diseases is not always crystal clear. Once they've got a target in mind, they then develop drugs. These are typically synthetic molecules that modulate that target, ideally in the direction of improving it. And then they design and fund clinical trials to demonstrate two things. To get a drug approved in the United States, you have to show that it's safe and it works on the disease that you say it's going to work on, so it's efficacious. You don't even necessarily have to know how that drug works. There are many drugs that are available on the market right now where we have some inkling how they work, but we really don't know for sure. But we know that they're safe and effective, and that's good enough for the FDA. And finally, once they've got this thing and it actually has some effect on the disease, they sell it. They try to market it and sell it, and they do so aggressively, as you might expect. There are several myths about drug companies, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of them. One myth that I didn't know was a myth until recently, but I've heard it in a few different formats now, which is the sort of myth that drug companies just take, things, the discoveries that are made in Gill's lab or my lab, and they just sort of patent them and start selling them to doctors and things like that. They don't really do anything themselves. They don't really add much value. They just take all this publicly funded stuff and sell it and market it. And that just couldn't be farther from the truth because, Gil and I like to think that we do very important things, and occasionally Gil actually does important things. Unfortunately, I don't. that they just don't have that kind of impact. And there's just no way that you have this direct connection that's clear-cut between bench and bedside. Even when new molecules are developed in a laboratory by a chemist, figuring out how to formulate those drugs, how to test them in animals, how to test them in humans, and do everything that's required to get a new drug approved is not done by academic scientists. It can't be done realistically by academic scientists, and I would argue that it shouldn't be done by academic scientists. Another one is that the pharmaceutical industry, Big Pharma, has so much marketing muscle that they could sell us anything they wanted. It wouldn't matter. They could sell us sugar pills to treat things because they're so good at selling things. And there's lots of ways to debunk this, but one of them is a very recent one. There's this molecule called Gibert, which is a form of inhaled insulin, should be used to treat type 1 diabetes. And Pfizer, along with many others, came up with this over years and years and years. It took a long time to get this product to market. But in the first 9 months of this year, they sold all of $12 million worth of this, which to a pharmaceutical company, especially one as large as Pfizer, is absolutely nothing. So just a week or so ago, Pfizer just threw up their hands and said, just forget, we're not even going to sell it anymore. It's just not worth our time and trouble. So, even though they've got something, it is safe and effective and it works, it's not necessarily going to be a successful business venture for a pharmaceutical company. So there's lots of reasons things fail. That being said, there's a lot of room for improvement, and I think that these are some topics that Professor Chu and I will begin to discuss in a few minutes. In terms of the pharmaceutical company, I would just say that there's a lot of room for improvement in the marketing business. They do a lot of direct-to-consumer advertising. You've all seen these ads on television. Ask your doctor about the rainbow-colored pill. It might be right for you. And there's a lot of data that show that this actually does change the prescribing habits and tendencies of physicians. And they also spend a lot of time talking to physicians. It's something we'll come back to, I think. The statistics are something that I think people play fast and loose with in the pharmaceutical industry. Not that they're wrong, but in that there are a number of different ways to present a given result from, let's say, a clinical trial. And this is one that we might come back to, a 31% reduction in heart attacks if you take our drugs. That 31%, I'd like a 31% raise in salary. I mean, it's a big enough number that I care about it. If that said 2.2%, I wouldn't necessarily be as interested. And then finally, in terms of trial design, there's a lot of things that pharmaceutical companies could do better. But it's not only pharmaceutical companies. Physicians also have, at some level, a professional responsibility to their patients to do what's best for the patient, not what is necessarily most convenient for the patient or for the physician just describing or prescribing a particular medicine. And this is a very difficult issue because there are so many different pressures on docs these days that there's no necessarily easy solution. But it's one that is definitely part of, as I see it, a problem in this business, which is the relationship between pharmaceutical companies and physicians. And also, finally, patients. There's a certain amount of personal responsibility here. I mean, the public, people who consume drugs, need to understand that there are no such thing as magic bullets. And there are no such thing as drugs without side effects. They do not exist. It's just a matter of dose. So that you have to understand when you're taking a medicine that there's a potential that it won't do anything for you, or there's a potential that it might do something bad to you. And as long as everyone's done everything they can to try to understand what the dangers are, then I think at some level people have to accept the responsibility that the pharmaceutical company is trying to make things safe and efficacious. But occasionally, the human body is an incredibly complex machine. We don't understand everything about it, and sometimes we get it wrong. On the other hand, there are cases where maybe we worry a bit that the pharmaceutical company hasn't done everything they could to make sure things were safe and effective, and that then there's, again, a lot of room for improvement. So I think I just wanted to stop there and say that by and large, the pendulum at some level is really swinging. Maybe 20 years ago, everyone loved the pharmaceutical industry. They were doing nothing but good for us. But in the past few years, in response to a number of different incidents, there have been an increasing number of people, and these are influential people. Marcia Engel was, until recently, the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, one or two most prestigious medical journals. Wrote a book called, The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. And she's not alone. There are others who are doing similar sorts of things. Let's see if we can get them to come up. Maybe not. But there are a number of books of this sort that are being published and right now. So there's a real genuine worry at some level that, at least as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it will ever happen, but there's a sort of concern that you might risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater at some level. I don't want new drugs to stop being developed, but I think I would like to maybe change the way that new drugs are approved. So this is just showing, on the take, how medicine's complicity with big business can endanger your health, so on and so forth. So it's not only people like Gil and I. There are a lot of people worried about these issues and publishing books on them, and so I think it's something that really does deserve some discussion. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Chu.
Is this? Just push the button on that. Yeah. Okay. I'll be right. Is the microphone working? Okay. So I'm going to speak a little bit more on this topic, and you'll see from what I have to say that I'm going to focus a little bit about what the drug companies do wrong as well as right, but we'll start a little bit about how they can be very good. Number of years ago, Merck was seen as a pharmaceutical leader, and part of that lay in the story of the African black fly. The African black fly will bite humans, and in the salivary glands of the African black fly are these microfilariae, tiny little worms. And when they bite humans, the tiny little worms can make their way into the human host, and the worms will crawl into the eyeball of the human host, causing what's called river blindness. It's one of the most common forms of blindness in the world, primarily because it affects huge numbers of people in Africa. There's another microfilarial organism that will crawl into the lymph nodes of the human host, blocking the lymph drainage. And in the lower extremities, what happens is fluid would build up there if your lymph drainage didn't carry the extra fluid up through the lymph system and back into the circulatory system. So when those lymph nodes get blocked, there's a tremendous amount of swelling that occurs in the legs here and in this male patient, the scrotal sac. This is elephantiasis, also caused by filaria. So between 1985 and 1994, Roy Vagelos, who was a basic scientist, was actually the chairman and CEO of Merck. A very unusual combination to have a real biochemist in charge of a drug company. During that time, it was voted as America's most admired corporation many times. And in 1987, they were studying the drug ivermectin, which is an antiparasitic drug that some of you may have used in your own lives in treating heartworm in dogs. And it was a very good drug, and it made Merck a reasonable amount of money. But what they discovered was that ivermectin would also cure river blindness, and then shortly afterwards they discovered it would cure elephantiasis. Well, it turned out that it only took a single pill, one pill once a year, and that single pill would control the disease. And the pill cost about $2.50. So Merck did some research to try to decide, whether this would fly. And they discovered that if they marketed it in Africa, they wouldn't sell any of it because nobody had $2.50 for a year's worth of drug. So they decided to donate the drug to the patients in Africa for free. And they not only did that, but they set up a distribution network. And so that they could get the drug to patients. They continued to sell it to dog owners in the U.S. at $2.50 a pill, and used the profits from that to subsidize the drug distribution network in Africa. Why on earth would Roy Vagelos do that? Well, he came to Stanford a couple of years ago and gave a talk, and we asked him why. And he said, if we got the reputation for being a really good company, really good scientists would want to work for us, because some scientists join a company because they think they're going to cure disease. And I actually met the scientist who discovered this thing about ivermectin for river blindness and elephantiasis, and he told me exactly that. That's why he joined Merck. And what Dr. Vagelos said was, if we can get the best scientists, that's priceless. Just for a few bucks, we can get the best scientists by being a good company. Well, he retired in 1994. And the person who replaced him was not a basic scientist. The person who replaced him came up from marketing. And what happened was the focus of the company shifted. They still had very good research labs, but they started to spend much more money on marketing. This is Dorothy Hamill, America's sweetheart. She won the gold medal in figure skating in the Olympics. And when she got a little bit older, she got used by Merck to advertise Vioxx. And you probably remember her skating on a lake in the Colorado Rockies, talking about the wonders of Vioxx. And if you type Vioxx into the internet, you can get Dorothy Hamill's picture. But nowadays, if you type in, this is what you get. And you get thousands of hits. And the reason, of course, is, as you all know, Vioxx had some problems. So we're going to investigate that a little bit. Okay. So what's the science behind the problems? Well, you have to know something about what are called cyclooxygenase enzymes, Cox enzymes. And what happens is there are these cyclooxygenase enzymes that do some very important things in the body. For example, when you eat, you eat arachidonic acid within your diet. And the Cox-2 enzyme, for example, the cyclooxygenase will convert this arachidonic acid into a whole bunch of different chemicals. And under physiologic stimulus like eating, some of these chemicals actually do many what we call housekeeping functions. For example, they'll allow platelets to work, and platelets are important for making blood clots. They also help the stomach, the stomach mucosal cells, the cells that line the stomach, to protect the stomach from digesting itself. After all, the stomach's job is to digest food, and you don't want it to digest itself. The Cox-2 enzymes, there's another class of enzymes called Cox-2 enzymes, actually respond to inflammatory stimuli, like, you play football and somebody tackles you too hard, or, things like that, or you did too much gardening this morning at your house. And what the Cox-2 enzymes do is they make prostaglandins in inflammatory cells, and as a result of responding to these inflammatory stimuli, you end up with things like pain, sweet, and swelling from the prostaglandins that are produced in inflammatory cells, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, in the old days, and actually now, we often take aspirin or naproxen or Advil to deal with this. And what aspirin, naproxen, or Advil do is they hit the Cox-2 enzymes to decrease pain, heat, and swelling, but they also hit the Cox-1 enzymes. And as a result, if you're not careful about how you take your aspirin, you get into trouble because you no longer have the products of cyclooxygenase 1 that help protect the stomach, and many of us have stomach problems when we take these things. So Merck had the bright idea, let's look for an enzyme that will just knock off Cox-2 and leave Cox-1 alone. That will be a really wonderful drug because we can take care of arthritis, for example, without bothering people's stomach. Patients with arthritis, middle-aged women, for example, with arthritis, have to take medications all the time. And sometimes they get to the point where they can't take these anti-inflammatories because of the stomach problems. Vioxx turned out to be the best drug for hitting the Cox-2 enzymes. There was none better. Annual sales, $3.5 billion. That's good. But there was a problem, and that is the Cox-2 enzymes also are expressed in blood vessel endothelial cells. These are the cells that line blood vessels. And these endothelial cells actually produce chemicals that prevent clots. And what you realize is that when you're cut, you need to make a clot to stop the bleeding. But on the other hand, you don't want your blood to clot all by itself, say in your heart, to produce a heart attack. So there's a careful balance that the body maintains. But if you knock out only the Cox-2 enzymes, the theoretical problem would be that you would lose your ability to prevent clots, but still retain your ability to make blood clots. And that, theoretically, could cause heart attacks. And that's something that was known when Vioxx was first marketed. The question is, could Vioxx cause heart attacks? Well, that's a very difficult experiment. You wouldn't really want to do that. But it turns out Merck did do the experiment by aggressively marketing the drug. And there's a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal entitled Emails Suggest Merck knew Vioxx's dangers at an early stage. They somehow got their hands on these emails. People are learning how to scrub their computers much better now. So Elise Ryson, I've got a picture of her for you here, in case you run into her on the street. In 1997, this vice president for clinical research at Merck wrote in an email, studies should be designed so the risks would not be evident. She knew. And so when they designed their studies, they excluded people who had any risk of heart attacks because they didn't want the numbers to be large. But in a way, that was the ethical thing to do because they were very concerned. The unethical thing was to take those studies and market it to everybody, not mentioning that problem. Skolnick in 2000, who was the president of Merck Research Labs, wrote an email, the cardiovascular risk was clearly there and mechanism-based. And he also wrote in the same email that it was a real pity. Well, the article came out. This is the key article in the New England Journal of Medicine. That was the linchpin for Merck's marketing activities. The New England Journal of Medicine, of course, is the most prestigious medical journal in the world. You get something published like that, and you hand out a reprint to a doctor, and we believe it. Because the New England Journal editors are tough. They only take the very best research. Well, what happened in that article was there were a small number of patients who had heart attacks, and it looked like it was statistically significant. And some doctors who read the fine print were worried about it, and Merck decided in response to develop a handbook of 16 pages of instructions that they would hand out to their drug salespeople. And in this 16 pages of instructions, which were labeled Dodgeball Vioxx, they would have sample physician questions, and then they would label the responses with the word dodge, and then tell you how to dodge the question. Now, Gurkapal Singh, who was an assistant professor, adjunct professor at Stanford, was a speaker who was getting money to speak on behalf of Vioxx. He did have some ethics, though, because when he started finding out about the heart attacks, he started changing his talks. And he started asking Merck for the safety data. So the first thing that happened was Merck decided to drop him from their speakers bureau. Now, this is hard on Singh because it turns out we professors, when we speak on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies, get paid much more than you would ever expect. The fee is generally $5,000 for a 1-hour lecture, and you get flown first class if you have to go somewhere else. Some people will give 20, 50 talks in a year. You can do the math. So he lost, by being honest, he lost his speaker's fees. But in addition to that, Merck called the head of rheumatology at Stanford and said, we're going to withdraw all of our funding for your research at Stanford if you don't get this guy to shut up. So that's called hardball, not dodgeball. So Richard Horton, the publisher of Lancet, wrote, in a recent editorial, we commended Merck for acting promptly in the face of new findings. That's when Vioxx was withdrawn from the market, and Horton said, that's good. You did a good thing by withdrawing it right away. But then this thing in the Wall Street Journal came out, and Horton wrote, our praise was premature. Merck and the FDA acted out of ruthless, short-sighted, irresponsible self-interest. This is supposedly an objective editor of probably the second most prestigious medical journal in the world. He would say the Lancet is the most prestigious one, but they're pretty close. All right. So the clinical trials actually did show increased risk of heart attacks for Vioxx when compared to naproxen. I need to give you a crash course on statistics. P-value stands for probability that the result could have occurred by chance. So when you see an effect, when you see something happening, you have to look at the p-value, because maybe it only looks like something is happening because of random chance, that the data just happened to fall that way. You threw the dice 10 times, and you got a whole bunch of lucky sevens, right? Okay, so physicians consider a result meaningful if the p-value is less than 0.05. There's less than 1 chance in 20 something could have happened by chance. For example, in a study of 1,000 patients, a few patients could get heart attacks. Drug X compared to drug Y, for example. Heart attacks occurred in, say, 8 patients on X, 3 patients on Y, or it could have come out 8 patients on X and 1 patient on Y. Those are associated with very different p-values. In this case, the p-value is 0.22, and that could have occurred by chance. But if the result were just a little different, that p-value gets to be 0.04, and if you have a journal article, you have to report it. Because that could have occurred because something was really going on. Because that's the mark that physicians use to decide if something might be happening. So that's the crash course on statistics. All right. So clinical trials actually showed an increased risk of heart attacks for Vioxx when compared to naproxen. There were 16 randomized trials between 1999 and 2003. Unfortunately, nowadays, virtually all clinical trials are sponsored by the drug companies themselves. The NIH doesn't have enough money to sponsor drug trials. So all the testing, virtually all the testing, is being done by the companies that stand to profit. Now, Merck sponsored all 16 trials. The relative risk for Vioxx was 2.24. The trial durations were less than 6 months, greater than 6 months, and the relative risks were roughly the same. It didn't really matter. So the risk, the p-value that something was going on here was insignificant. That relative risk looks like there might be something going on. But what about the trials that Merck sponsored that did have an independent endpoint committee, people not on the payroll? Now, the reason Merck would do this for 8 trials is that the New England Journal of Medicine won't publish your article unless you have an independent endpoint committee. And if you can't publish in the New England Journal, you're not going to be able to get the word out to the doctors quite as effectively. So in those 8 trials, the relative risk for getting a heart attack was almost 4-fold. In the other 8 trials, where there was no independent endpoint committee, there was some committee, but as far as we can tell, they were on the Merck payroll, taking Vioxx actually looked to be protective. There were fewer heart attacks. Could this difference in outcome of these 16 trials, could that have occurred by chance? So in this Lancet article, they evaluated whether that could have occurred by chance. About 1 chance in 100 that could have happened by chance. So that's very likely to be real. It totally depended on who was looking at the data. Merck's employees or an independent endpoint committee. Now, in the article, Bombardier et al. That I showed you, they saw that effect, and they had an independent endpoint committee, but they suggested, well, maybe the difference is not because Vioxx is dangerous, but because naproxen is really good. And so they hypothesized naproxen might be protective. There was no evidence whatsoever that that was true. Well, as a result of that very high-profile article, a bunch of people went out to do clinical trials. Because if naproxen were this miraculously good, we might want to give it to everybody. So everybody started doing trials to see how great naproxen was. And these are a large number of trials. 1, 2, 3, 4, all these trials were done to see if you either favored the control, which was not naproxen, or favored naproxen. So if you're on this side of the line, on the left side of the line, the trial favored naproxen. If you're on the right side of the line, it favored the control. You can see that most of the trials are very close to the line. Naproxen didn't do anything with respect to heart attacks. Okay, it does help with arthritis, but it didn't do much with heart attacks. The size of each of these boxes is the size of the trial. The length of the line is the uncertainty, the confidence interval, due to statistical variation. And you can see that a few of the studies seem to be to the left of the line. Interesting. Those are the trials sponsored by Merck. Could that have occurred by chance? The p-value is 0.001, that effect could have happened by chance. The correlation with sponsored by Merck was very strong. All right. Deaths attributable to Vioxx, 50,000. Vietnam, 58,000. As of 4 days ago, the Iraq War. The Iraq War is getting a lot more publicity. Okay. Now, what about the trial that was actually published in the New England Journal? These are editors of the New England Journal. They were called to testify in some of these trials. So they started reviewing the electronic data that was submitted to the New England Journal for publication. And you can do track changes on Microsoft Word. So they actually found out that at least 2 of the authors knew about 3 additional heart attacks 4.5 months before publication of the article in the New England Journal. These are the editors of the New England Journal. They're feeling betrayed. The 2 authors were our friend Elise Rice and Deborah Shapiro, both of Merck. And the 3 additional myocardial infarctions occurred in patients taking Vioxx. And that actually would have changed the reporting in the article somewhat. And certainly the risk was even higher than originally reported. But they didn't bother putting those into the article. And, okay, so is the Vioxx case just an isolated incidence? Unfortunately, we don't really have good court records for every drug out there. We have a lot of the stuff on Vioxx because the stuff was subpoenaed. But what we do know is, in the news, you've heard about Avandia, which is a drug for diabetes. I mean, that's good to be able to treat diabetes. The bad part is that we just discovered it can cause heart attacks, even though it can lower blood sugar. So it's an oral hypoglycemic. Prozac, a very good drug for treating depression. It turns out that for a long time, the increased incidence of suicide among teenagers was kept quiet. Now it's getting out. But a lot of teenagers ended up killing themselves. Aranesp. This is an injectable drug that is used to treat anemia. And actually, this is a great drug for the drug companies because when you give a single injection in the office, it costs $12,000. And the drug company gets $4,000 of that. And the doctor that gets the injection gets $8,000. So what a great marketing tool. It turns out that in randomized studies, it looks like Aranesp, which is a growth factor, and what it does is it stimulates the growth of precursors to red blood cells. It turns out the receptor for the growth factor also is on some cancer cells. And there's some evidence now that Aranesp might increase the growth of cancers. And Aranesp is used primarily in cancer patients to treat the anemia from chemotherapy. So what happens is that when the drug companies did randomized trials recently to try to see if they could get everybody on Aranesp, the patients who didn't get Aranesp lived longer. So if you watch the stock market, Amgen's stock took a big hit. And so if you want to try to judge whether there's going to be an impact or if the data might be true or not, watch the stock market. So psychiatric help, 5 cents. The doctor is in. So what Tom and I want to do is to talk about how we can fix the problem.
Thank you very much. So we need good drugs. Is cash king? How do we begin to address this problem? We have about 20 minutes for dialogue, and then we'll be able to take questions.
Let's see. Cash king. What do you think what do you think the best way to start would be? Do you think that you need to start with the suppliers, pharmaceutical industry, or do you need to start with physicians and patients? So the sort of the suppliers or the users. What do you think would have the most impact on the problem?
I think the drug companies, for example, Merck in the old days, with a story with ivermectin, showed that the drug companies can do good things on their own. I think, unfortunately, the demands of investors are such that short-term profits may be driving the behavior of the drug companies, and the drug companies on their own may not be able to act appropriately, especially if they're in a competitive business. I think it's a little bit like the 100-meter dash at the last Olympics for women. They just took the gold medal away from the winner of that Olympic Games. And it turns out the person who came in second is the Greek sprinter who got banned from track and field for not showing up for her drug tests. The people who finished third and fourth in that race also have been banned for drug use. So it wasn't only Marianne Jones, but the person who came in second, the two people who came in third and fourth. The people who came in fifth through eighth in the finals, that's everybody, the rest of the women, come from countries that don't do drug testing. So we don't really know what their status is.
So what you're saying is that you and I had a shot at the gold, is what you're really saying. And we've been at the right place at the right time.
So the problem for the drug companies is I think all of them are behaving in the same way. And if you're in a very competitive business, you're not going to do the right thing if everybody is shaving data or doing clinical trials that are slanted. There has to be some other stronger incentive to behave in the right way other than your good intentions.
So what would you do? Would you think that maybe drug companies shouldn't run clinical trials? They shouldn't be allowed. They can develop new therapeutics. They can do their own testing, and then they turn it over to an independent agency. The FDA all of a sudden is now running clinical trials, and therefore the data is in the hands of a third party, not the drug makers, not the drug users, but a third party. Is that something that's a reasonable solution?
So what Tom's proposed is that let academics, for example, run the clinical trials and don't let the drug companies run the clinical trials. And the FDA will only approve drugs on the basis of trials run by independent investigators. So that's a very utopian view.
Why is it utopian? Why couldn't we do that?
Who's going to pay? Somebody has to pay for those trials. I think some people have proposed that the drug companies have to put money into a kitty to allow that to happen. That's probably a naive request because Congress would have to vote for it. And it turns out the biggest lobby in Washington is the pharmaceutical lobby. I am not optimistic that that's going to happen. The pharmaceutical lobby is huge and powerful. So what do you think? Do you think we can get to the utopian ideal of having independent people run clinical trials?
I think so. I think that the overall driving pressure for the business, which is health, is not going to go away. People are not going to stop wanting to live longer, stop wanting to treat their diseases. So to the extent that there's a driving force for the business model and a demand for new therapeutics, that is going to be there. So as long as that demand's going to be there, I think that somebody is going to try to meet it. And how do you meet it? Well, essentially, unlike the days of the snake oil salesman, you couldn't just make something up and sell it to people. There are rules and regulations. And I'm not a legal expert on the details of how those rules and regulations are written, but it seems to me that either the rules aren't strong enough about how the studies need to be set up and run, or the rules are strong enough but they're not enforced strictly enough about how the studies need to be set up and run. So it seems to me that we've already got, as you say, many people who want to make a difference to mankind by developing new therapeutics are doing the kind of research that they want to be doing. They're developing new drugs. And so it comes down to a matter of how do you evaluate those new therapeutics? How do you test them? Do you try to take the testing burden or duty away from pharmaceutical companies and put it in the hands of a third party? Or do you just change the way that clinical trials are designed and approved? I mean, just the examples that you showed about independent endpoint committees versus non-independent endpoint committees seem to suggest to me that if you do have some sort of independent oversight, that you get an outcome that is a bit different than you don't, and the outcome in this instance happens to be in the right direction toward patient safety. It sounds like a good thing to me. So, really the market isn't going to create this kind of barrier. It would have to be by regulation. The federal government would have to say, look, people are worried. They're worried that the drugs that they're taking are not as safe and not as efficacious as they could be. And I don't know. I think that the public is at some level reasonable. They understand that, if you can teach people to understand that there's no such thing as a drug with no side effects. As long as somebody taking a medicine is confident that there were smart people on the other end of those trying to figure out if this drug is as safe as we could know. Is this drug as safe as it could possibly be? And fully disclosing the risks involved, I think that's where personal responsibility comes in, and people might, be a bit more comfortable. But when you get into this situation where a couple of patients here and there get shaved to change a p-value to get something published, it's a relatively small number of data points that have an incredible impact on patients and other things. And the whole business has to be structured so that that's not possible to do.
I think one thing that one change that I think would be easier to accomplish, especially if citizens start pressuring their representatives to deal with it, is we have something that we can fix, and that's the FDA. The FDA used to be a really good agency. It used to protect the health of American people. It used to really worry about whether drugs were safe and whether they worked. The new FDA is actually a very different kind of FDA. I think morale is suffering at that agency. And the reason it's suffering is because of a congressional act called PDUFA, the Prescription Drug Users Fee Act. And that act had a good purpose. It wanted to give the FDA more money so that the FDA could go through the approval process for new life-saving drugs more quickly. Because the U.S. had a reputation for acting very slowly. There weren't enough investigators at the FDA. And the FDA clearly needed more funding. The problem was Congress decided not to pay for it, but to actually have a $500,000 user's fee paid for by the drug company that was asking for its drug to be approved. And so the FDA now is basically funded by the drug companies. So that's changed the culture of the FDA. The customer is no longer the people. The customer is basically the people paying the freight. And it's the drug companies who are paying for the FDA right now. And one of the things about the PDUFA is that the money cannot be used for post-marketing analysis of the safety of the drugs. It has to be used for speedy approval of the drug. So the data for the dangers of Vioxx was there, sitting there, but not being analyzed. Because the funding for the FDA forbids that use. So we can change the FDA. It can certainly be changed. And I think there's some hope that we might be able to do it. Because frankly, people in Congress and citizens are pretty angry.
One of the things that's always struck me as a little odd in this business of clinical trials is that the pharmaceutical companies get to decide, what it is they'd like to do in terms of a clinical trial. Do they want to take their new drug and do they want to test it against an existing drug for the same disease, or do they want to test it against a placebo? And there are certain ethical issues that go into the design of a trial, but quite often, companies set up placebo-controlled trials. So they might get their drug approved, showing that it's safe and that it does something for the disease, but there will be no data from that trial about whether drug number 2 is any better than drug number 1, which is currently on the market. And that strikes me as fundamentally odd and fundamentally unfair. And I know of a recent study, which was an example of a clinical trial that was actually funded by the government. It was funded by the NIH, called CATIE, C-A-T-I-E. It was a study of 5 different drugs for antipsychotic medications. And there was one very old one on there, and there were 2 or 3 that had been around for about 10 years, and there was one newer one. And after running a long enough study to be statistically significant, they concluded that in terms of the disease that these drugs are supposed to treat, all 5 were pretty good. They're all about the same. And, the conclusions of the study were very careful. They said that, at the individual level, different patients respond to different drugs. And so that tells me that there's a need for more than one antipsychotic drug. But on the other hand, it tells me that the newer does not equal better. And just a couple of years ago, about 5-6 years ago, right after Vioxx was approved, I was having dinner with a seminar speaker. This is a very, very smart biologist who will almost certainly win a Nobel Prize in his lifetime. And the topic came up of he plays violin and how he often gets sore, but it turns out he was a very big fan of new drugs, and he always starts taking them just as soon as they come on the market. And he was taking Vioxx. And he said, oh, it works great, it's wonderful, it's better, it doesn't upset my stomach like naproxen and so on and so forth. And I said, well, does it really help with a lot of the pain and the stiffness? He said, oh, the pain and the stiffness really isn't so bad. I just figure it can't do any harm, so I take it as almost prophylactically. And this is one of the smartest people I know in my business. And I've just always had the opposite view. I don't want to take a new drug on the market ever. I'd like to see, I'm comfortable after 20 or 30 years on the market. Artificial sweeteners, sugar's worked okay for a few thousand years. I'll stick with sugar. At least I know what the problems are as opposed to artificial ones. So I guess I'm a bit more conservative in certain respects. But some people are just early adopters. They just,
just a point of information. I think Tom needs to tell his friend that he has to be alive to get his Nobel Prize.
Right, that's a good point. Good point.
And so if he dies of a heart attack before he gets the prize, he won't be eligible anymore.
Yeah, I guess. But this idea of actually, running trials against, the current best model, the current standard in care, is something that I think, could be enforced or could be encouraged, at the FDA. And exactly as you say, if the company is paying for the trial and they may not want to do it, they may have a bit more leverage to try to, craft the trial in a different way, which avoids doing that kind of head-to-head comparison. But I think that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I think from what I can tell, a lot of clinical trials are designed to try to increase the market for the drug. And as a result, they're often carefully designed not to answer the scientific question you really want answered, but to get a paper that you can hand to a doctor that will convince them to use the drug. And it's completely predictable. What researchers in academic institutions want to do is to really answer the questions. And one of the sad things and it's a really disturbing trend, is that in the old days, just a few years ago, the drug companies would sponsor the trials, but the trials would occur at leading medical schools. And the drug companies would give funding to the medical schools to conduct the trials, and there'd be this yin and yang, push-pull about whether the thing should be published, how to couch every phrase. Drug companies found academics very difficult to deal with.
Not the two on this stage. The other academics, it would have been somebody else difficult.
So, and academics, the other thing academics do is they're very slow to write up their results. They tend to worry about what they're writing. So it turns out that actually, in the last few years, there's been a sea change in who conducts the clinical trials. About 2/3 of all the clinical trials sponsored by the drug companies, and they're sponsoring almost all the clinical trials, about 2/3 of those trials are now being done by CROs, contract research organizations. So they've been able to sidestep those pesky academics and hire contract research organizations to do the trials. And the CROs will do it for much less money and the results always come out better. One of the largest centers for the CRO research is a converted Holiday Inn in Florida. So that the, quote, hospital in which the trials are being done is often not quite that. And there have been some horror stories that you can go on and look at on the internet about what's happened in some of those clinical trials. I think it's a very bad trend that the CROs are taking over, because quite often physicians aren't in charge anymore, not even physicians. They're getting physician assistants, nurse practitioners to do the work because they can be hired for much less money. And so they're not actually looking quite as carefully about what's going on in those trials.
Don't mean to cut you off.
No, I thought that was a good time.
Good.
Unless Tom wanted to.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. We now have up to 30 minutes for any questions that you might have, and you may pose it to either speaker or to one or the other. And I often take the opportunity to ask the first one, just because I have a microphone. But on the question of microphone, do we have a roving microphone? 2 floor microphones.
Back,
one
right
there and one here. So if you have a burning question, you may start working your way to a microphone. My first question is, this topic is very interesting to me because I was in the U.S. Army, and I left 17 years ago. For some reason, I don't know if it's just my unit or whatever, officers leaving the Army were heavily targeted by drug companies, recruited for careers in drug companies. Several of my friends took them up on the offer, and after a few years quit because they said they couldn't live with the lack of what they perceived as lack of ethics in dealing with doctors and pushing the drugs. I don't know what viewpoint they had, but that was 17 years ago. My question is, this seems to be a new problem based on the titles of those books that were presented, the titles of the books that Tom showed. What, in your opinion, has it always been there, or what it seems to be worse, if new? Is it PDUFA that you perceive as the underlying reason, or what do you see to be the prime motivator of this change? Maybe the amount of global money in the business, or what is causing it, and can we address it through examining that?
Well, I think one sort of fundamental problem, which is there's not much you can do about, is that drug discovery is difficult. It's very, very hard to find something that will treat the disease and do no harm. So once you have a drug that's approved, you have a period of exclusivity typically. You have a patent on that, and you will have a few years left on that before it becomes generic and the price goes down quite a lot. So essentially, you have a window of opportunity to try to make as much money with this product as you can. And as I said, developing new drugs and paying for clinical trials is very expensive. So in order to try to recover your costs, should you spend all of your money trying to develop a next drug, which may or may not work, or should you spend a lot of money trying to sell the drug that's already approved and you have exclusivity? And for, even your sort of lemonade stand on the curb businessman, it's pretty clear what you do. You try to take advantage of the products that you've got. And so this relationship between pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, people that sell drugs, and physicians who prescribe drugs is one that has a lot of potential for conflicts. And to be real honest, those conflicts are going to be invisible to the patient sitting in the office because they don't know who their doc talks to. And when their doc says, you should be taking drug A, not everyone's really comfortable. I'm not even really comfortable saying, well, how come you're suggesting drug A and not drug B or drug C? Do you speak for the company that makes drug A? Are you visited by their reps? Have they sent you to Barbados and so on and so forth? It really gets in the way, even in a background way, of the relationship between patients and physicians. I think that's part of the problem.
So Henri was asking us why the change, because drug companies didn't always act this way. I've actually thought about that question. And so I went back in history to see what might be the reason. About 15 years ago, there were no ads on television for drugs. And it was about that time that the FDA decided to issue guidelines on what you could do for television advertising.
Yep.
And once the guidelines came out, advertising proliferated.
Right.
The other thing that's really interesting is about 20 years ago, the Hatch-Waxman Act got passed. The Hatch-Waxman Act was actually really, on the face of it, a good thing, but it had unintended consequences. The good thing was the National Institutes of Health sponsor research in our laboratories here in academia, and what Congress wanted to do was to figure out a way to get the fruits of academic research into the public sector as quickly as possible so we could help patients. After all, it's the National Institutes of Health. And what the government decided to do was a very generous thing. They decided to give up their patent rights to all the fruits of research and said that the universities could share the royalties with the drug companies and the government would stay out of it. That was a great thing. A lot of new discoveries moved very quickly to the clinic because Stanford could license some of the great things that they discovered to Merck or Pfizer or whatever, and those things would get implemented very quickly. Okay, that was the good part about it. The bad part of it, and this is also linked to the drug advertising on TV, is that as a result of that, it was a little bit less important to do the fundamental research in the drug company itself. You could buy a license, and it might be cheaper. In addition to that, because you could now advertise on television, the budgets of research went down a little bit. The budgets of advertising and marketing went up a lot. And when those balances change, the people in the company with the biggest budgets become more powerful, as we all know. And Roy Vagelos, who was a scientist, was replaced by somebody from marketing. And this happened across the board, one after the other. The balance of power in the drug companies shifted. And so the drug companies became more focused on marketing and less focused on finding new drugs. And as a result, a lot of the old-time drug companies are now in something of a quandary because they don't have new drugs in the pipeline. So what they've done is make Me Too drugs to copy other successful drugs, competitors of Lipitor, competitors of Prozac, and so on. And so they're making, quote, new drugs, which are not really new. They're just modifications of, variations of old drugs. So things have gotten kind of out of whack. And the other thing was, why would they go after the military? Well, guys coming out of the military are pretty clean cut. They have short hair. They're healthy. They're fit. They look good. Now, they've shifted away from Henri's buddies in the military because now the majority of drug reps are cheerleaders. The New York Times ran an article on...
Literally, not figuratively.
They really are cheerleaders. That's the best thing on your resume if you want to be a drug rep.
Absolutely.
And if you do want to be a drug rep, it's a great profession. They actually make more than the doctors they're selling to. And doctors make a reasonable amount of money, I can tell you. So you can just be a cheerleader. And then you can get trained to be a drug rep.
There are no ugly drug reps.
Thank you. Thanks very much. All right, our first question. Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking about ways to get clinical trials and drug testing done. It seems that insurance companies have a lot of money and that they might be able to have something to do with that for, like, the placebo-controlled trials. And when I think about head-to-head testing, the first thing I think of is Consumer Reports, and it seemed like some high-budget version of Consumer Reports might be best, and that would be something that the consumers would actually trust, and wondering what you thought about those.
I think that's a great point because, the drug companies are very powerful and have a lot of money, and they want to sell more drugs. And the insurance companies are also very powerful and have a lot of money, and they want to cut costs. So what the questioner is proposing is that we figure out a mechanism to get them in the arena together and pit them against each other, and so that we can get a little bit more balance in the marketplace. And the devil will be in the details. It really is a very optimistic point of view that we may be able to get that to happen. Now, right now, the insurance companies are reeling because, 5 years ago, the jokes were all about the insurance companies, right? The lawyers got replaced by the insurance companies as the devils out in the marketplace because they were denying effective treatments to patients, and the patients were up in arms. But some way of balancing that would really help. Now, it turns out the biggest insurer in the country starts with an M. It's Medicare. And Medicare is incredibly powerful. But Medicare was actually prohibited from negotiating for better prices with the drug companies just a few years ago. When the administration changes, maybe things will change. But under the current administration, what's happened now is that there's a prohibition for Medicare to even negotiate lower prices. A result of that is people go to Canada for their drugs. People in Europe pay half of what people here pay. One of my fellow faculty members is married to a woman who was born in France and has family in France. And they go to spend the summer in France every year for free. How do they do that? Well, they buy all their medications while they're in France. So basically, the U.S. is supporting the rest of the world in terms of drugs. We're paying much more than the rest of the world for the same drugs. It's a real issue. But if we can get the insurance companies the right amount of leverage, Medicare being one of them, we might be able to get somewhere.
Great. Thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Well, in some sense, you anticipated my question. I was going to focus on the national versus international. You mentioned the FDA that, in fact, the basic question is, what can we do about this? And part of that question is, what can we do how? So, for example, through the FDA, through legislative processes, and yet you mentioned a number of bills and so forth that have made things worse, that have changed the pricing. And I know one instance that I've seen that I've been concerned with is just the FDA itself, the fact that you can't get drugs without going through this process. You talk about people that go overseas to get drugs cheaper. A lot of people go overseas to get drugs at all, go down to Mexico or whatever. And so a question there is, what role should the FDA really play? I mean, I'm delighted to have drugs that say they're FDA approved, but does that mean that's the only drug that I should be able to get, that I should have to go to Mexico or Canada or somewhere else to get it? And I personally would hope not. On the other hand, there are issues, like down in Mexico, antibiotics, are everywhere, and they're in some sense polluting the commons. And so that would be an issue that would have a global effect. So I see this kind of trade-off between personal choice and personal opportunity that I would like to get the FDA out of versus kind of global issues like the antibiotic one. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
Right. I guess, a lot of these questions relate to, and these issues really relate to sort of free markets and economics. And there's similarities and differences. For instance, if you think about, choosing a cola, I'm with you. I'd like to be able to choose any cola I'd like. I don't want somebody to tell me I can only have Coke or Pepsi or whatever. If there's something from somewhere else, I'd like to have, low barriers and lots of opportunity to have as many things as possible. But when it comes to things that can have a real negative impact on people's lives, I think it becomes a lot more difficult for the average consumer to figure out whether or not something's really good for them and whether or not they need to believe what they're told. I think that if you're talking about soda pop, people can play fast and loose they can advertise it that it will make you look better or whatever, or make you more attractive to members of the opposite sex, and that's fine. They can get away with it because there aren't so many necessarily adverse consequences to false claims. So for these sort of matters of human health, I think it's very important to have some sort of authority make judgments and give things a stamp of approval about whether or not, they are safe and whether or not, yes, indeed, they do treat hair loss, or they'll just allow you to think you're treating your hair loss. I think it's an important question where it's hard to be truly libertarian about it, because there's no way the average person can get their hands on the information to decide whether a new medicine is going to be safe and effective.
This is great. I only agree with half of what Tom says, so we can have a little bit of a debate. Coke and Pepsi are a pet peeve of mine. Coke and Pepsi are probably more than any other product responsible for the epidemic of diabetes in this country. And it's a really serious issue. Now, on the flip side, it turns out that Tom can choose between Coke and Pepsi, but he can't get other drinks that have not passed the purview of the FDA. It's the Food and Drug Administration, and they do look over food. And so I'm actually kind of glad they're looking over food, but they apparently don't really care much about Coke versus Pepsi. You're still free to be a diabetic if you want. But it is true that the Food and Drug Administration does watch over our food supply. They do require truth in labeling. You have to write down what's in that product that you're buying. And I think those are important things. If the entire market were unregulated, we'd be in big trouble. And you're still free to go to the supermarket. You have plenty of choices, and you can eat yourself into oblivion if you want. But at least we've got the FDA to kind of look over things. I really do think that there is some role for regulation here. There is one industry that is not regulated by the FDA. So most of what goes into your body, the FDA takes a look at. But there's one industry that's escaped completely, scot-free, and that's the food supplement industry. The stuff that you get at the health food stores, those supplements, ginseng, whatever.
Nutraceuticals.
The nutraceuticals. Now, the reason for that is there was a coalition lobby of that industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and patients who wanted freedom of choice to get what they wanted. And that industry is incredibly polluted with corruption. It's unbelievable how corrupt that industry is. I won't touch this stuff. It is really potentially dangerous. There have been some frightening stories that have been articles that have been published in the New England Journal about what's in those unmarked bottles, really.
I'm going to stay away from those now. Thank you.
No, the bottles will say ginseng, okay, but there's no need to prove that it's ginseng.
And the batch-to-batch variation.
And what I can tell you is that people have done high-performance liquid chromatography to analyze what's in those bottles. And it turns out that there's a high incidence of, say, digitalis in the bottles. Digitalis, you'll remember, is the precursor for digoxin, and when taken in an unprescribed way can cause fatal arrhythmias. So there have been a number of documented deaths from digitalis poisoning. And there have been several other things in food supplements that have caused rare forms of kidney cancer, for example. And those people died. It's not a fun thing. This is an unregulated industry where anything goes. You can be a cowboy. You can stick it in the bottle, and people will buy it amazingly. They'll go to Whole Foods, which looks clean and so on. Looks very yuppie-like and safe, but it's an unregulated industry.
Yes, sir.
If I'm in the soft drink industry and I come up with a new soft drink that's marginally better than the other soft drinks, but I charge 3 or 4 times as much money for it, I put it out in the market, very quickly it'll fail because people take it and say it's not worth it. However, if I have a drug that's marginally better than what's out there, maybe a generic drug, okay, I put it out in the market, and I put a lot of advertising behind it, and the people are not paying for it because it comes through their insurance or whatever else it is, I can make a lot of money that way. I just pour more money in advertising, tell your doctor you demand Wizadrin, no matter what he says, demand Wizadrin. So is there any way of balancing that? Because it causes everybody's Medicare and everything else to go up.
Let's see. The motto of Wonderfest is
truth is a great flirt.
Truth is a great flirt, and information is really important because if you get the word out, people will respond.
But there's no incentive in this case because I'm just a hapless person that has whatever it needs, and if it was like I had to pay for it myself. definitely I go to Consumers Report and it says, hey, it's a wash between this and aspirin. And I say, damn it, I'm going to get the aspirin. However, I'm going to the doctor and my Kaiser pays for it, and I pay a straight fee. And I think it might be a little bit better because it's newer. Okay, and all this advertising keeps doing it. You can't say truth here because they can create the truth.
Right. Well, there's a really bizarre element to a lot of the healthcare system in the United States. One is that we talk about the healthcare system in the United States. We don't really have a healthcare system in the United States. We have about 150 different healthcare systems in the United States. We have a very strange three-way relationship between the people who need healthcare and the people who provide healthcare, and then our employers and the insurance companies. And if you go back and wonder why this is that you get your health insurance and it's tied to your job, if you think about it just a little bit, there's no reason that has to be. And this is an accident that came out of government regulations during World War II, as I understand it, when, to avoid a lot of inflation, there was a shortage of good labor, so people capped prices. But employers found that in order to get good employees, they couldn't offer them more money because the government put the ceiling on their wages, but they could start offering them other things, and one of the things was health care. And that just stayed with us after the war ended and the price controls were lifted. The health insurance was tied to your job and so on and so forth. So it creates this strange three-way relationship which really distorts markets. People don't have to make decisions about what's coming out of their pocket for drugs. They don't even have to think about it. They just can believe what they hear. I want the better drug.
I think you've put your finger on a really fundamental problem, that medical economics and normal consumer economics are very different beasts. The soft drink that's too expensive dies. The drug that's too expensive often does even better. And there are really deep reasons for this. First of all, it's because the truth isn't always apparent to the consumer. In other words, you, the consumer, the person who actually takes the drug, you're not an expert in the drug. So you can't evaluate it very easily, right? Whereas if you take a Coke, you can taste it and decide whether you like it or not. Not only that, but you've pointed out that you as the consumer are not the purchaser either. The insurance company, somebody else, a third party is paying. So you're less price sensitive. And finally, the person who actually knows something is the doctor, right, who's trying to help you by prescribing the drug. And it turns out the doctor is getting kickbacks to give you certain drugs. So I call it kickbacks. It's really called an administration fee. You've put your finger on a really fundamental problem. It's not easy to see how to correct it overnight because the person who stands to benefit or be harmed by the drug isn't paying the bill and doesn't know enough to know. And really the key ingredient here has to be who's going to advocate for you. Right?
Right.
And my feeling is that the only viable advocate for you is your doctor. And we really have to be sure that your doctor is following the Hippocratic Oath and is only thinking about you and not thinking about college education for, Bridget or a new Mercedes or a bigger house in the hill, a summer house.
Send his kid to Stanford.
So there are some real issues here about the doctor, because what's happening, I think, and this is the huge threat to the medical profession, is that the drug companies have found out that the best way to market drugs is to make sure the doctor does really well if they prescribe the drug. And there's something about a conflict of interest here and ethics that's very murky. You really put your finger on a huge issue, and it's not easy to see how it's going to be fixed, except by the Amish way. The Amish way is, in a small community where people get to see what everybody else is doing, public disapproval is very powerful. And, transparency. If doctors among themselves start to say, we have to behave properly or our profession will be in trouble, and start to enforce and develop a code of ethics, maybe things will start to change.
Right. Just imagine if you had the information or had access to the information from every doctor's office about how many prescriptions they wrote for each drug. There might be interesting information in there, especially if that were tied to, their income tax reports or something like that. Now, that's a level of oversight that would scare the heck out of a lot of different people for a lot of good reasons and a lot of bad reasons. But quite honestly, how many prescriptions does each doc write is information. You and I can't get it, but the pharmaceutical companies get it. So they can keep track of all the docs who work in the areas that they sell drugs on. And they know, month to month, week to week, sales or scripts are going up through Office X or Office Y or down. Oh, maybe it's time to send a couple of drug reps around to remind the doc about how good this product is because it appears that they've forgotten. So, there's a lot of this that goes on.
So the pharmacies actually sell prescription information on drugs to the drug companies. The pharma reps can go home at night, log on, find out what you prescribed that day, and then in response to your prescription habits, they can target their marketing. But they don't just show up and try to convince you that the drug is better. They show up with presents and gifts for your office staff, lunch, and so on. And it turns out that there are 80,000 doctors in this country. There's an organization called No Free Lunch, where doctors have pledged, they joined this organization called No Free Lunch, and doctors who've joined have pledged not to accept free food from the pharma reps. There are 800 people who have joined. So as the number gets bigger...
Thank you. We have just about 5 minutes left. If we're quick, we could probably get in 2 more quick questions. I'm alternating microphones, so this one first and then this one. Let's try to keep it quick.
If you can't really count on your doctor, and you certainly shouldn't trust the ads, there's Worst Pills, Best Pills published by Public Citizen, and I would like to know what could be done to give that greater visibility and get them more resources.
I honestly don't even know about it, so obviously they don't have enough resources.
It's a group that was started by Ralph Nader, and they are a watchdog on several different issues, but one of the big ones is pharmaceuticals.
Can you say the name of the organization once more?
Worst Pills, Best Pills, was that it?
That's the name of their book.
The name of the book.
The organization is Public Citizen.
Oh, Public Citizen. Well, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have been erroneously medicated or prescribed bad medicine twice recently. In one case, the instructions with the medication said, if you have this side condition, there are side effects and you shouldn't take this perhaps and you should consult with a specialist. And I found that my internist is simply not knowledgeable enough and not curious enough, and particularly extremely reluctant to consult with a specialist. So I don't know what you can do to get more information to more internists. I'm not saying they're on the take. I don't have any information along those grounds. In another case, I had a change in blood conditions, and the acting internist called me and said I had a serious problem, I should see a specialist. When the regular internist came back, it was simply ignored. She wasn't interested. I had to make my own arrangements to go around her and to see a specialist to verify that I did have this condition. So I think that there's a problem, I don't know how general it is, of internists not getting enough information and being reluctant to consult to act on it.
Right.
Comments?
It sounds like you might want to shop around for another internist. Right. Have you already done that? Yeah. And that's a wonderful thing. You can go find another one.
Right. But honestly,
the Palo Alto Medical Foundation nearby used to have an ombudsman, and I consulted with the ombudsman and explained what my problem was, and he recommended I get a new internist. Then 2 of them, changed what they were doing, but I found that using the website and looking up all the medication is something I have to do for my own protection.
That's a very difficult thing to do, and it's also hard when, physicians, so one could argue that physicians have a professional duty to, make decisions about drugs that they prescribe with the best information possible. And given the demands on these people, the majority of the information that they get and they consume does not come from independent third parties. It comes from pharmaceutical reps or other mechanisms, meetings that are sponsored and paid for by pharmaceutical companies where they bring them together and educate them about particular things. But there's no guarantee in cases like this that you're getting unbiased, independent information. It's very, very difficult for physicians to carve out enough time to keep up with the data and the literature with everything else that they do. It's extraordinarily tough. But some do. Many do.
Thank you for those excellent questions. I'm afraid we're out of time. Sorry about that. We thank you for coming to this panel, everyone, today. And will you join me in thanking Drs. Chu and Wandless?